Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the GIA Web Conference, The Secret Sauce for Rural Arts Funding in America. My name is Sujin Chan, and I am the Program Manager at Grantmakers in the Arts. While many of us live and work in cities, unless your foundation or arts agency specifically funds work limited to urban geographic boundaries, you are likely in some way supporting artists or organizations in rural or semi-rural areas. And we know that working in non-urban communities is different, from expectations on audience reach to definitions of artistic excellence to the nature and the cultivation of grantee relationships. Today we're thrilled to welcome Arnie Fishbaugh and Cinda Holt from the Montana Arts Council to share on the ingredients important to making rural arts funding meaningful and successful. Arnie Fishbaugh is Montana Arts Council's Executive Director, a position that she has held since 1992. She serves on the board of a number of national service organizations, including the boards of the Association of Performing Arts Presenters, National Assembly of State Art Agencies, and of course GIA. Cinda Holt serves as Business Development Specialist for Montana Arts Council, where she brings over 30 years of experience in nonprofit management and corporate development consulting. Cinda also serves as a board member for the National Service Organization CRAFT Emergency Relief Fund, also known as SURF Plus. We look forward to learning a great deal from their combined local and national experiences with arts funding, and in particular with the unique characteristics of funding in rural areas. But first, a housekeeping note. Throughout the presentation, you can type questions to Arnie, Cinda, or both in the rectangular text box at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to all of them during the Q&A session that will happen after the conclusion of the presentation. So Arnie will get us started today. Welcome, Arnie.
Hi, thank you, everybody. Greetings to everybody from Big Sky Country. So Cinda and I have lived and worked in the arts in a variety of places, from New York City to the farm I grew up on, a mile out of Carter, Montana, population 80. For the last 20-plus years, we have returned to and loved living in Montana. During our collective 70 years of experience, and when I actually wrote that number, I about had a heart attack. I suddenly felt so old. Anyway, we have observed funding practices that work especially well in rural settings. The outcomes in these communities can be just as significant to funders as those we'd find in urban neighborhoods. We're sure webinar attendees can add to the set of observations that we're going to share with you today, and we welcome your thoughts in the chat room on the web, which, as Susan said, we'll get to at the end of the session. From our view in Big Sky Country, this is how it looks where I live, where I'm from. Here's our experience that describes the reality and demography of rural America. It means distance and isolation, although rural Connecticut is probably not as lonely as rural Alaska. As a rancher who lives in the northern corner of our state says, "Come on over for a visit. I'm 30 miles west of town. It's the second left." Resources and venues can be scarce, although we recognize that a place like Woodstock, New York, has a very different per capita income and available resources than, say, Woodstock, Minnesota. And Branson, Missouri has more theaters than Branson, Colorado. But as a rule, it's not going to be easy to find money to make things happen, so you have to be ingenious. The cafetorium is alive and well in all the communities that don't have a formal theater. There is a definite sense of community in rural America, and people are more grounded to the landscape and to each other. Community pride is a more important factor. It outpaces advertising in people's decisions to participate in the arts, according to research we did as part of our Wallace Foundation START grant in the early 2000s. I think that's really a unique feature of rural America, that community pride would weigh so much more heavily. The opportunity to see and hear something special ranks highly as a reason to attend an arts event, because these experiences can be few and far between. Another key motivator is the opportunity to share an arts experience with family and friends. There is more participation in civic and school events in rural Montana than in urban areas, and we think that's probably consistent nationwide. Curatorial approaches to design a season of events are not usually relevant. Designing a season to educate the audience and take them on a journey doesn't happen often as a rule. What does matter and what is relevant is inventing a season, like snapping up national performers who are traveling between Minneapolis and Seattle, and also presenting local community theater, or mounting an art exhibit of collections from people's nearby homes in between a traveling exhibit from the Yellowstone Art Museum. Standard fare in big cities may be a new experience to us. Rural America is older than the rest of the nation. 25% are senior citizens. Weather can play a much more threatening role in your daily life. You may not be able to get out of your yard for a week, not a day. In rural towns, everyone knows each other, and it's been my experience that what they don't know, they'll frequently make up. You are often in the same room with people you don't agree with, and some you can't stand. Feuds and reputations can last generations. There's a reason why the song "Town Without Pity" has rung so true, at times, to many of us. Rural America is not as ethnically diverse as urban America. The 2010 census reports that approximately 78% of the population in rural and small town communities are white and non-Hispanic. This compares to 64% of the population in the nation as a whole. In rural America, you have extraordinary access to political power. It's not uncommon for Joe Sixpack to meet with the governor personally instead of an aide. People know their legislators, they go to church with them, have coffee or a beer with them, go to the same football and basketball games, and partake in the same book club. Everyone wears more than one hat. On the right here is the mayor of Sindastown, named Gene, in Stevensville. He is also the local historic hotel owner, owns 3 Main Street buildings, and is a Little League coach. On his right is Joan. She's the director of the Main Street Association, the Garden Club president, and a Historical Society volunteer. She just totally looks like one of those, like a garden society president, doesn't she? Okay. In rural communities, arts experiences have an afterlife in bonding people together. Here is the newly formed board of the Sanders County Arts Council after their first strategic planning session with Cinda. I think that's hysterical. Okay, friendships are regained and forged through the collective work needed to make a cultural event happen. Sometimes old feuds even go away.
All right. Now that we've had a good picture of life in rural America, let's talk about the secret sauce for effective funding. The funding of networks is extremely important. These networks benefit arts organizations by sharing challenges and resources. We find there's a freedom in information sharing. You want to work together, and it's definitely not competitive. Networks provide key infrastructure so that all boats can rise with the tide. This regional or statewide infrastructure can produce results collectively in smaller communities that would normally only be expected in larger organizations or bigger cities. Long-standing consortia in rural America are more important than in urban settings because there's a paucity of resources. Consortia adds value, knowledge, and a solid potential resource base for all its members. It also provides touring possibilities that would never come to one town for a performing arts or a visual arts exhibition. Here's our roster of statewide consortia by artistic discipline. And of course, at the bottom, we can't forget the importance of all the other networks in all the local arts agencies of our fellow states. Consortia of individual artists also creates extremely important infrastructures regardless of where artists live. In Montana, we've developed the Montana Entrepreneur Program. It consists of 8 cohorts of 6 to 10 artists each in rural areas operating throughout the state, and each of them serves as their own network and then also collectively as one big statewide cohort. Organizational consortia can produce powerful funding outcomes, but consortia are frequently ineligible for funding from foundations. Bigger is bigger, but not always better. And in case you don't recognize this, I love this slide. Her perch is a tractor tire and her bouquet is a sheaf of wheat. So there are many cases where rural organizations don't necessarily want to get bigger. They want to do what they do better. The reason for this is the very practical approach they take in understanding their organization's own capacity, in its leadership, and the community's ability to support it. As a result, grant programs designed to expand what an organization is doing is not often as relevant, nor are programs that are designed to expand partnerships or build scale. In fact, the whole notion of scalability is different. In rural America, scalability is not necessarily relevant to breadth, but is more relevant to the depth of experience or to the community building that comes about because of a project. Now, typical metric measurements of numbers of people, for example, who are reached are not the same in rural America as in their big city relatives. Here you may have more people attending an event than actually live in the town. So what does that say about the bonding that it forges in developing a sense of and a value to a community? It's huge. Now, multi-year funding is especially valuable here for several reasons. Rural arts organizations often don't have staffs, so volunteers have a longer learning curve, and they need more time to get results. There are many demands on their time because they wear so many hats in their community, just like we saw with Joan and the mayor. A multi-year commitment allows organizations to bring productions to their community annually or to experiment, to succeed or to fail, and to learn from these endeavors. In Indian country in Montana, this is what we know. There is overwhelming poverty on our reservations. To honor each other and the family, their way of life must be tribal to survive. We've learned that we have to become a partner for the long haul. This means more than one grant or 1 year. It means many years, possibly 5 to 10, to help develop a lasting impact. We have to step out of the way so our tribal artists, through their own tribal lives, are in control of their artistic stories. They have let us know loud and clear they do not want others to tell their stories. American Indians living in Montana do not see themselves as victims of a disastrous past. They see themselves as much more than survivors. They see themselves as thriving. They have outlived calamity, and they're continuing to grow and perpetuate their culture. In Indian country, as it is with immigrant populations throughout the U.S., success in arts funding can only be achieved if the program is fostered by people from the ground up, not the top down. Most of our past work with our Indian ethnic and immigrant communities, developed with frameworks we use for everyone else, simply do not work. Trying to force those models is wasted energy, and continuing to do so inflicts what we'd call an inadvertent racism cast onto the work we do. We need instead to consider a really big overhaul. For instance, we can't conduct our entrepreneur program for artists living on the reservation the same way we do for artists who have access to really basic things, like a working car and money for gas, or food on the table and child care. And we need to examine how we're asking for information. Just one example in Montana is the negative perceptions about our applications and reporting requirements from people whose culture of information gathering comes out of strong oral traditions. We're looking at how the models themselves need to change to be responsive to those traditions. And speaking of being responsive,
another ingredient of the secret sauce is to let your grantees produce outcomes you need and can't get on your own. Instead of saying what you fund, focus instead on the outcomes you want for your funding. For instance, we fund operating support grants, like many of you do, that support the arts education mission of the organization. What we really need as a result of this funding, however, is to produce arts advocacy for the work done by our grantees and its value to the public. The reason? Montana has no arts advocacy organization, so we're it. So we've retooled our operating support grant program so that it produces the advocacy outcome we need. These grants are called public value partnerships, and they really serve us by becoming a contract for advocacy work. Each grantee is asked to meet personally with legislators. Many of you in the listening audience have heard about this, to inform them how we use this funding and tell their legislator about the value their organization is producing in the community. In both Public Value Partnership and our Cultural Trust grants, grantees are asked in their final reporting each year, how would you answer if a legislator wanted to know what the return on investment is for the state support you're receiving? We ask they provide this answer as a story, not as a series of facts, so that we can retell it in our conversation with political, business, or education leaders. In our arts education program, grantees are asked to share any stories, favorite moments, or quotes from those involved, students, teachers, parents, audience, others, that express the benefit of this artist experience. This can be at the personal or community level, anything that made them glad they went to all this work. And some of those stories are the most compelling things we've ever read. They're just incredible. We tell the grantees that the Montana Arts Council will use this feedback to better explain the value of state and federal support for the Artists in Schools and Communities program. As another example of focusing our grant programs on outcomes, our agency's strategic plan outlines key frames we're going to operate under. We went through the plan, examined each and every frame, and made sure that we had a grant program or a major resource of the agency that addresses each major frame. For instance, innovation is important in our plan, so we created the Artist Innovation Award specifically to address this criteria. In our experience, we've learned that a little money goes a long way. Rural communities know how to stretch a dollar like nobody else, and it's incredible what they can do with a small amount of money, and remarkable what they can do with a big amount. There's no bigger bang for the buck in our view. As to artistic excellence, we want to reinforce that there are many people who live in rural America who are innately talented and creative. They also may have a bachelor's or music degree or master's degree in the arts, but have chosen a different field to work in or are teaching in rural America. Because of this, the quality of work coming from these rural towns can not only be surprising but most impressive. They also have hidden artistic treasures and a surprising degree of creativity and artistic talent. People live in rural America many times to pursue their passions. They make a decided choice to live in rural towns because of the sense of community it brings to them, the landscape that attracts them, and the quality of life. Or simply, they may be the ones who inherited or married into the family farm, ranch, or business. As for this whole quality issue, I'm struck by the big attitude adjustment I had to make when I moved from New York City back to Montana. I always thought that to be a quality theater company, you had to have equity actors. Well, I learned my lesson out here. To my surprise, that was absolutely not true. There is plenty of fine theater in Montana because of the talent and creativity of the people living here. In Montana, like anywhere, one leader can make a huge difference, such as a conductor and guest artist coming in, inspiring the musicians, and raising the bar so that the entire orchestra achieves new heights. There is frequently a misperception that people in rural towns are satisfied with mediocrity. That's not the case. They strive for the best performances and exhibits, great sets, and fabulous costumes. In rural America, artistic excellence can frequently be defined as striving for excellence, not as a national standard that's laid upon us by people in the big cities. Working to improve quality is just as important as producing artistic excellence. Like this mask, and take a close look, an extraordinary use of wheat and straw. So that's our secret sauce recipe, and I'm going to recap the ingredients. Networks are critical. Consortiums are valuable, and we wish that more consortiums were funded by major foundations. Bigger is not always better. Scalability is more about depth than breadth and numbers of people reached. Multi-year funding is really important. Our work is best when it's ground up, not top down. Our grantees can and should be our outcome producers. A little money goes a long way. Artistic excellence, every community strives for it. This school is near my hometown in Fort Benton, a town of 1,500 and the home of the Montana Ag Museum. The message on this wall that greets you at the front door says it all. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share our rural America with you. And we know our listeners, no doubt, have great ideas for additional ingredients to our secret sauce, so we'd like to open it up to your ideas and questions. You are able to find the Montana Arts Council at arts.mt.gov. And thanks so much to everybody for allowing us this privilege.
Great, thank you so much, Arnie and Cinda, for that, for the secret sauce, the ingredients for the secret sauce for rural arts funding. I really did find that map that you presented really extraordinary, and taking a good look at it and seeing that it was made out of wheat was really extraordinary. Just a reminder to folks to ask your questions at the in the rectangular text box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go ahead and get started with some questions and answers. And then we'll just start with this question about the internet. How has the internet changed the concept of isolation that you referred to earlier?
This is Cinda. I'll tackle part of that. We learned an interesting statistic about folks in rural areas that have connectivity issues. They seem to leap right past the satellite and direct line connections into using mobile devices. So there are many more people who access the internet 100% by mobile devices as opposed to computers or DSL lines. And that, of course, changes the way information is presented and translated. Also, we find that the whole discussion about copyright, trademark protection of art on the internet is now surfacing as a very big issue for people in rural areas because it may be the only means by which they get their art out to the world.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Arnie, did you want to add anything?
No, I think she said it. She said it very well. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask two questions that are kind of similar, a little bit two sides of a similar coin. Do you see Montana's leaving rural areas to go to bigger cities? And at the same time, you had mentioned that the rural communities are mostly white, and do you see that changing? And if so, how's that changing the landscape in the rural areas?
Okay. I'll take a gander at that. You know, we certainly see small towns drying up. And I think that that's kind of true nationally, perhaps with the exception of those towns that are bedroom communities to big cities. But we're losing population from our cities. They're going to the mountainous regions. Just like when you look at a map of the United States, people are moving from the center of the country to both of the coasts. So our population, at least in our state, is growing marginally. It's very interesting. What we find is that people move out. They move out of state when they get out of college or get out of high school, and then they move back. And they move back when they retire because this is home. And I'm sure that that's true in many other cases. In our particular situation, I know this is true in other states. We also have people moving from out of state into the beautiful parts of the state, either as second homes or as retirees. And so it's our job to work with those particular individuals to help build audiences. Um, and then, Sujan, I forgot the second part of the question. Oh,
Well, I've
yes,
got a couple.
the ethnic diversity issue. Our state is slowly gaining in ethnic diversity, but I would venture to say it's at a much slower pace than rural states on either of the coasts. Um, and so it's still pretty white here. It's still, the majority is white. And those the percentages of other races hasn't changed that much. Okay?
We have a little more than 90% white. We have 7% Native American, and then the remainder are all the other ethnic races combined. Also, we are feeling, as most states, a slow increase in Mexican immigration working in agriculture, and that too will have an impact on us. It very soon they will probably compete with that 7% number of our Native American communities. Also, it's interesting from the 2010 census, there was a report that in a number of towns that had between 2,000 and 6,000 residents, many of them registered between 25 and 30% outmigration in that 10-year period. So that is a huge number of people in towns that size that are leaving. Now, in some cases, they're just heading to a larger city in Montana because, as Arnie referred earlier, our state population has been modestly growing, but the migration within the state is changing dramatically and leaving rural and moving into the communities that are larger than 20,000.
You know, I think that in our case, like I look at the town I went to high school in, Fort Benton. When I went to high school, it was 1,800. Now it's 1,500. My graduating class had 52 people. Now it's about 16. We had a football team, a basketball team. Now they don't have enough kids to be on the football team, ours, and so they're having to combine with other little towns around the area to create a football team. So it's really interesting.
And
I think
I can actually.
part of that it has to do with what is the local economy in those areas. You know, if you live in a rural area and it's a tourist economy, they're going to be doing great. In most of our state, it's an agricultural economy, and so you have farmers. The farms are getting larger and larger, and so families are moving out. They're selling, they're leasing, they're moving out because you can't make it on the same section of land that you could 30 years ago.
Actually, we have another question that has to do with the demographics, and the question is, how do you engage your younger demographic in an established organization whose vendors and audiences are aging out, and that's probably particularly an issue if you're also seeing migration, out-migration.
Well, I think that there are organizations that are just doing a dandy job with this by involving the younger generations in as advisory committees or in some integral way into the structure of their organization. So in Montana, just like it's happening all over the country in organizations that are doing good work, they're asking people what they'd like. We know, for instance, that one of the big reasons that people don't attend arts events, young people don't attend arts events, is that they don't have anybody to go with. So arts organizations are finding out ways to create social hangouts, artinis at the art museum, um, other ways to make it so that there's a more convivial place to gather for people who don't have somebody to go with. And so I think involving people who are part of the audience that you want to reach in the planning of the arts organization is really critical. And letting them run with the ball, that's another big thing. It's like we can't really force our old people's way of doing things on young people. Fine.
Are you seeing, because the towns and um, areas are shrinking in population size, that you're seeing some of these long-time groups fold, or?
No, they're still going strong, and I'm telling you, it's been our experience, and I think this is really important. I'm sure this is true nationally. These little arts organizations in these stinky little towns are doing better than the major arts organizations in many ways. And it's because, number one, they're relying mainly on earned revenue or a stable source of contributed income, and they're not expanding their budget. They also, because they're in rural communities, they are expert at relationship building. So when we were talking earlier about how, you can't really hate your neighbor too much because they don't know when that person might save your life. It's that kind of concept where, you've got people and you have a relationship with them, and you know them, you respect their differences, but you bring them into the fold. And nobody does this better than rural communities. And did you want to add anything?
Uh, I would like to comment on my perspective as the business development specialist for the Arts Council. A portion of my job is to travel throughout the state and work with boards of directors that are in some form of need, not necessarily crisis, but trying to reinvent themselves or trying to address the changing demographics of their community. And what strikes me is their proactive desire to come together as a collective and learn from each other how to reinvent themselves. It is a different psychology than having somebody come in who skews the meeting and has all the answers, or if there's a board member who wants to take over the entire thing and just wants everyone else to follow them. That doesn't happen. What happens is a group dynamic that I cherish, where everybody puts their best foot forward and tries to learn from each other and move together as a group.
We have a question here about grant size. What's a typical grant size? What's the typical term? What kinds of work do you tend to fund? And does it tend to be more operational or program?
Yes, in our state, and I should say every state arts council is different, but in our state we fund operating support grants for organizations that have a minimum of a half-time staff person. They're grants of up to $10,000 a year. They're 4-year grants so that they don't have to apply every year. And we also use their final report as their application for the next 4-year grant cycle. Arts education grants range from anything from $500 to $10,000. We also have a small grant of $1,000 that are available on a monthly basis for both artists and arts organizations for strategic investments in networking, community outreach, marketing, and emergencies. And
in certain cases, when we've had an influx of private monies, for example, with the Wallace Foundation, when they were funding building arts participation in rural America, we were able to re-grant up to $25,000 or $30,000 to organizations for one-time audience development work. That was wonderful. And through Link Foundation and the Tremaine Foundation and the U.S. Department of Agriculture in their Rural Communities Development Initiative, we have been able to create an entrepreneur program that translates to about a $10,000 to $15,000 value to each artist that participates in the year-long curriculum.
Yeah, we also have the Cultural Trust here, which is, sometimes the bane of our existence, frankly. All we do is defend that Cultural Trust. Anyway, the problem with the Cultural Trust, I don't know if other states are having this nightmare, but the interest earnings that constitutionally the trust is mandated to invest in safe vehicles, so it's invested in long-term bonds. Well, the bond market has been horrible, so the interest earnings are terrible, and so the money available for grants is just pitiful. So in that Cultural Trust, we fund operating support, special projects, and capital expenditures, and it's available for a 2-year grant period for arts organizations, history and humanities organizations, or any kind of cultural organization.
How do you balance the funding between rural communities and urban populations? You mentioned some programs. Are they only available to rural areas, or how do you level the competition in a grant program?
Oftentimes it's determined by the funding source. For example, the Rural Communities Development Initiative through the U.S. Department of Agriculture is only accessible to rural communities. In other cases, the population is not an issue. I'm happy to report that unlike some of our fellow states like Utah and Colorado, although we have a large city, and our largest city is Billings with just a hair over 100,000 people, it doesn't have that complete disconnect from the rest of the state where, like Colorado, you have Denver, and in Utah you have Salt Lake. So although there are oftentimes requests and certain kinds of pressures that come from the urban communities, it's relatively easy for us to split our support the same way that the demographics read, which is about 46-47% rural, and the remainder is urban. And it also should be noted that in that 46 or 47% that's rural, a huge geography is called frontier, and the population is more rural than rural. It is fewer than 6 people per square mile.
Right. The other thing that we do is, for each program, we really look at where we're funding to make sure that all the money isn't going. We call them our 6 big cities. Well, our 6 big cities are 25,000 people or more, and with the largest being about 100,000. So, that's very different than a lot of places. But we do look at that. And so what's fascinating is, like in our Public Value Partnership grant, we just went through a new big cycle of those. And we do have rural organizations applying for funding in that category if they have half a staff position, an FTE, they're eligible. And, based on the criteria for that program, there were rural organizations that fared a lot better than some of the major organizations in the state. So, I think we try to look at them. We look at them with with an eye cast towards fairness. We realize that rural organizations, for instance, don't have professional fundraising staff, professional grant writers, so our panels take that into account. But frankly, we find some of the rural applications to be much more compelling than their urban counterparts. It's really fascinating.
So it sounds like you guys, you definitely put a lens of fairness. So we have a very similar question coming from Michigan, and he's asking about if there's any explicit strategies that you use to help level the playing field or to create criteria.
Well, when we're talking about criteria, one of the things that we do. Hang on one second, I've got a cough. Hang on. Sorry about that. One of the things that we do when we get done with the grant panel, then they do all their scoring and everything, and we're kind of ready to go. We take a look at the geographic distribution and the size of the organizations that are getting funded, and that's when we take that. That's when we would take our magic wand, and our council does that, not the panel. The council is in charge of looking at, are we satisfied with the geographic distribution of this funding? Are we satisfied, that we are not giving all the money to the western part of the state with Missoula, which is where everybody thinks all the arts happen in our state is Missoula. And so it's done. It is strategically done, and in the criteria it is said that the council has the authority to make balances for geography and arts disciplines.
And we've also had or prompted a series of conversations about the concept of artistic excellence, because when we're developing our criteria, we want to be sensitive to the resources that are available to many communities, and much as we'd love to bring the New York City Ballet to every town in Montana, it will never happen. So what those communities tell us in terms of their interpretation of artistic excellence is the involvement of the community, the depth of the experience, the takeaways that they've had, and that information now translates into our criteria. So that is a proactive way that we have been sort of pushing our own boundaries of how to describe something like artistic excellence. It's easy to fall back on the typical concepts behind artistic excellence. Is it award-winning? Does it have an international reputation? Does it have years of producing? All of those things may not be as relevant in our world as it is in an urban setting where you have much better and faster access to those kinds of organizations.
Makes a lot of sense. So we have a question about if a funder is particularly interested in exploring funding in rural and or Indian country, who would be a good source to introduce them? Would it be the state agency? And he points out that there are so few private funders right now for this work.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think in terms of Indian country, there are the state arts councils or arts agencies would have a handle on not only their own activities in that arena, but in other state agencies' work. And then also, I cannot say enough about the First Peoples Fund and Lori Puget as an excellent national resource for Indian country discussions.
I'll just have one last question, and then we'll let you guys go. This question is about the teaching artist population in the state. And the person asked, what is your knowledge about the teaching artist population? What types of training opportunities or professional development opportunities are available to build the teaching artist pool? And where does Montana sit with all these opportunities?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know about the total population of teaching artists, but we have a cadre of teaching artists that are doing great work here, and we've done two major trainings this past year for teaching artists. One there were about 65 teaching artists that came to Helena for a weekend, and uh, they had a whole series of workshops, professional development workshops. We also then partnered with Salish Kootenai College, excuse me, over in Pablo, and we sponsored a 10-day professional development workshop with teaching artists and with teachers regarding arts integration. So it's a very important topic in our state, and it's further the situation and difficulties are further exacerbated because here we have a paucity of music teachers, and the schools are cutting back budgets like they are everywhere else. So, teaching artists are really an important thing. We also, for the first time, have been successful in partnering with our state Office of Public Instruction to help sponsor these, excuse me, these workshops. So that's been very productive. So we're pretty pleased with the work that we've been doing this year. Wish it was more, but we're pretty pleased with it. It's an active, ongoing priority for the agency, and it's in our strategic plan too.
Well, we're coming to the end of our session, but before we go, I just want to thank Artie and Cinda again for sharing their insights and knowledge with us, and I think all of us are a little bit better able to support artists and arts organizations working outside of the cities and in rural areas. Today's presentation has been recorded. I will be sending you a link to that file in the next day or two, along with a brief survey that we hope that you'll take a few minutes to fill out. Your feedback is always really important to us. And if you would like the opportunity to flip through the slides now, we switch the controls over to you, and they'll be up for the next hour or two. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.